the bottom line, I think, is there won't be any more major bank failures. Governments have made it very clear here in the last 6 or 8 weeks they'll allow no major banks to go bust. Small banks, tiny banks, yes, they're always vulnerable because they don't matter very much. But the consolidation going on right now means that big banks will be protected. What the US is doing now effectively is what Canada and Australia have done for 100 years. We are now going to have in this country 4 dominant banks. Citibank, the Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and JP Morgan. There'll still be 8,000 other banks, but they will account for 20% of the banking system. Those 4 big banks will, by the end of this year, after one more acquisition by Citibank coming in the next few weeks, be almost 60% of all bank assets. This is a very, very dramatic change from American traditions and American customs. We historically had, going back 30 years ago, a very decentralized banking system. We had 15,000 banks. We had a ban on we had bans on interstate branching. Here in Illinois, we had a ban on any branches. You only could have a single unit bank. So now we are totally abandoning those policies. We've been abandoning them for some time, but now we're going to allow the domination of the system by 4 major institutions. And Canada and Australia have had that for some time. Both countries have 4 or 5 dominant banks that control 80 or 90% of bank assets. So a big change in our customs and traditions here, partly as a result of this crisis. So we're still in the midst of the crisis. We're in a very severe recession, which most people on Wall Street think probably has 9 months to run. It'll run through the second quarter. In the current quarter, growth will be devastating. Real GDP in this quarter could fall by 5 or 6%. In the first quarter, maybe 2 or 3%. By the second quarter, we could be close to 0. A lot will also depend on what the Obama administration does in January. The Democrats have been flirting now in the Congress for several weeks with a new fiscal stimulus package. They want to extend unemployment benefits, give local governments more money for infrastructure, things like that. But the expectation is nothing will happen in the next 2 weeks. It'll all happen in January, and Obama has now huddled his economic team to try and produce proposals. But the best guess in Washington today is that Obama will unveil in late January possibly a stimulus package worth as much as $250 billion. In his election campaign, he promised a tax cut to low and middle income Americans. Now he really can't give he can't really give an income tax cut because 40% of the American people no longer pay income tax. Our system is now so progressive that 40% of all tax is paid by the top 1%, and the bottom 60% pay less than 5%. But he can still give these people who don't pay income tax some kind of tax credit or tax rebate. It'll effectively be a welfare check, but they'll call it a tax credit. And this would pump into the American economy $100 to $150 billion. Democrats would also like to do more for infrastructure spending. They'd like to extend unemployment benefits. And there will be a rescue package for the U.S. auto industry. The Congress agreed 6 weeks ago to approve a loan guarantee program for the auto industry worth $25 billion. This was capital to be used to rebuild old plants to make more fuel-efficient cars. But now the Democrats want to double this to $50 billion. And GM has been to Washington over the last week to warn, if we don't get help from the government, we will go bankrupt sometime in the first quarter of next year because we're burning up our working capital at the rate of $2 billion a month. And GM needs at least $12 or $13 billion of working capital simply to conduct business. Now what the trade-off will be for this, we don't know. Will the government destroy the equity holders and the bond holders like they did with the banks that were nationalized a few months ago? The people who had IndyMac shares or had shares in Washington Mutual? We don't know. My guess is they won't want to totally wipe people out. If they don't, GM bonds might be a great buy. But we don't know exactly what they'll do, so there's still risk in GM equity and GM bonds. The other victim, of course, could be the trade unions. GM pays a wage 67% above the national average. Its health care benefits for its retired workers have no parallel anywhere in the American economy. They're very, very generous, and they're very, very expensive. And they cost GM several $billion every year. I can't believe there'll be a government intervention without some attempt to rein in those very, very excessive and very extreme benefits. And indeed, GM itself is doing that. They announced a few weeks ago they're going to curtail now all health care benefits for non-union retired workers. If you were a GM white-collar executive, you had unlimited health benefits. But as of December 31st, you will lose those benefits because you don't belong to the union. So if you belong to the UAW, there you've got a contractual guarantee, a contractual right, and your benefits will, for the time being, be secure. Only a GM bankruptcy could force a change in those benefits, force a change in those contract terms that were negotiated quite some time ago. So we will have, in January, policy changes that might guarantee the recession will end by the summer. All we can do is watch and wait. But I do think the greater danger we have, looking out a year or 2 years, is that even when the recession ends, the rate of growth will initially be quite modest. Historically, the Federal Reserve can turn the economy around by slashing interest rates and producing a big upturn in housing starts and home building. That then leads to more consumption a few months later. But it's going to be hard to have a big turnaround in home building because we've got a big glut of unsold homes. We have 2.3 million vacant houses. We have 1.5 million houses in foreclosure. And we nominally have, listed right now for sale, 5 million homes. Much greater number than we had 2 or 3 years ago. Right now, the ratio of unsold homes to sales is about 10 months. 2 years ago, it was 4 or 5 months. So with this excess supply of housing, it's hard to see housing starts getting back to a very robust number anytime in 2009, and probably not even in 2010. And if we don't get a home building recovery, we'll be missing one of the dominant growth locomotives that normally pulls the U.S. economy out of recession. And we have the problem that because profits are going to fall 14, 15% next year, firms will be under pressure to cut costs. We've had, so far in this business cycle, fantastic profit performance. In 2006, U.S. corporate profits as share of GDP were at a 50-year high. In the last year and a half, financial profits have collapsed because of all the problems with mortgages. But even here in the third quarter, the growth of non-financial corporate profits was still, year on year, running at 12%. A really good performance. But now, with GDP about to fall 5 or 6% here in the fourth quarter, we're going to have a bloodbath of corporate profits. Retailers could have huge losses here in the fourth quarter. Manufacturing firms now will have to deal with falling orders. So there will be, over the next 6 or 9 months, a much greater contraction in profits than we've seen so far. And I think average profits next year for the S&P 500 as a whole could be off about 15%. Down dramatically for retailers and for financial companies and for automobile companies, less dramatically for others, but still negative for the first time in 5 or 6 years. And that's what this big stock market decline has been about. A whole lot of new profit uncertainty. We're past the worst of the financial crisis. We're past the risk of bankruptcies now in big banks and investment banks, but we still have to deal with recession and the profit uncertainty that creates. Let me spend a minute now on the global economy. If we look at the world economy, we've had in the last 3 or 4 years the most benign world economy I think mankind has known in 2,000 years. Last year, 120 countries had a growth rate over 4%. Many leading emerging market countries had growth rates 3 and 4 times as high. China's growth rate was 12%. India was 9%. Russia was 8%. The Persian Gulf, Middle East was 7%. The African continent, 6.5%. And Latin America, 5.5%. We truly had, a year ago, even 9 months ago, a very broad-based global prosperity. That's what's helped to give us this year the great U.S. Expo. This crisis now is changing the outlook quite profoundly. Europe and Japan are now also in recession. We've seen a big decline over the last 2 or 3 months in manufacturing orders in Europe and Japan. We're seeing weak retail sales. And in the case of Spain, Ireland, and Britain, we've got real estate downturns as bad as are going on here. And for the British people, real estate's an even more important household asset than it is in America. So when British house prices fall, that does significant damage to British consumption. The Japanese economy's had a very funny economy for the last 5 years. They've had almost no growth in wages. They've had a lot of growth in exports, and they've had growth in capital spending because of exports bolstering corporate profits. But wages have lagged. So Japan's had a kind of unbalanced recovery, and now because of global conditions, Japan will have an export downturn, which will also next year depress capital spending.